I never thought a single morning could shatter everything I had worked for. The call came just as the sun spilled over the city skyline, cheerful and ordinary, until the words hit me like a freight train. "We have to let you go." My hands shook, my chest tightened, and the office around me blurred into a haze of disbelief. I had given 10 years of my life to that company, sacrificed weekends, birthdays, every ounce of energy, and now it was all gone. No warning, no chance to plead, just a clean, brutal dismissal. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Each red light felt like a countdown to humiliation. My mind raced with panic. How would I pay the bills? Rent? Utilities? Food? The questions screamed louder than the honking cars around me. When I pulled into my driveway, I hoped for comfort, for understanding, for even a small hug that might tell me I wasn't completely alone. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the coldness before I saw it. My daughter's eyes, sharp and unyielding, met mine. "You're a burden," she said, her voice cutting through me like a knife. "We can't support you. Figure it out yourself." I froze. Her words weren't just rejection. They were an accusation, a verdict, and a sentence all at once. I looked at my son, my spouse, searching for any sign of warmth, any hint that they understood what I was feeling, and found only indifferent faces, eyes turned away, swallowed by their own concerns. I wanted to argue, to explain, to plead for a shred of compassion, but my voice faltered. The air in the house felt heavier than the winter outside, suffocating, oppressive. Every memory of past sacrifices, every sleepless night spent worrying about them, seemed meaningless in that instant. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt alien, like I had been erased from the life I thought was mine. I stepped back, my heart pounding, the echo of her words reverberating in my skull. I needed to leave before my own despair consumed me. I opened the door and paused on the threshold, staring into the fading light of the street, unsure where I could go, unsure if there was anywhere left for me in the world. My future, once so certain, now hung in a fragile, terrifying balance. The night was waiting outside, and I had no idea which way to turn. I hadn't always been on the edge of despair. There was a time when I believed in the promise of hard work, in the idea that dedication could secure a stable life for my family. I spent years pouring myself into my career, often at the expense of my own happiness. Late nights at the office, skipped meals, weekends sacrificed to meet deadlines. I convinced myself it was worth it because I wanted my children to grow up without fear, to feel the security I had never known. Every paycheck, every promotion, every exhausted moment was meant to build a foundation they could rely on. But life has a way of unraveling even the most carefully laid plans. My marriage had been strained long before the layoffs, worn down by differences we could no longer bridge, by arguments that began small and escalated into silences that lasted days. I loved my spouse once deeply, with a loyalty that demanded compromise, yet somewhere along the way, that love became a quiet tension, punctuated by frustration and resentment. We stayed together for the children, for appearances, for the illusion of family harmony. It was easier to maintain a facade than face the truth, and so we endured, even when the warmth had faded. Raising my children alone for stretches of time had shaped me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I was the parent who drove to every recital, who attended parent-teacher conferences while barely catching a moment of sleep, who stayed awake through countless nights of worry when either of them fell ill. I sacrificed my own ambitions to ensure their dreams could flourish, often setting aside my own needs so theirs could be met. I thought those sacrifices would earn gratitude, love, and loyalty, but somewhere along the line, the dynamic shifted. My efforts became expected, my presence tolerated, and the appreciation I once felt evaporated like mist. Even in my career, I had always been the reliable one, the person colleagues turned to in crises, the one who stayed late to fix problems no one else would touch, the one who quietly carried the weight of the team. Yet when the world shifted, when layoffs came and the corporate ladder I had climbed so carefully collapsed beneath me, that reliability counted for nothing. I realized that being dependable had not built an impenetrable shield. It had only made my absence more noticeable, my vulnerability more stark. And then there was my family, the people I had devoted decades to nurturing. I loved them fiercely, but love, as I discovered, is not always reciprocated in the ways one hopes. There were moments, small, almost imperceptible, when a glance, a smirk, or a calculated word hinted at ambition that outweighed loyalty. One family member in particular seemed quietly disengaged, calculating and ready to seize an opportunity that would elevate themselves, even if it meant letting me fall. I had noticed it before, dismissed it as imagination, but in hindsight, the signs had been there all along. Subtle comments, hidden frustrations, fleeting eye rolls. It haunted me now, because as I faced rejection on the day I lost my job, I realized that the very people I had sacrificed everything for might not stand by me when I needed them most. Their ambition, their secret discontent, was a shadow looming over the fragile threads of my family life. And though I couldn't yet name it, I could feel the tension building, a quiet storm gathering behind smiles and polite nods. I knew then that my struggle was only beginning, and that some battles I was about to face would not just be with the world outside, but with the people I had trusted most. At first, I didn't notice the subtle changes, the tiny cracks that slowly widened between us. It was in the way my daughter spoke over me during dinner, her tone sharp, almost rehearsed, as though she had memorized lines to belittle without leaving evidence. I thought I was imagining it, attributing it to teenage moodiness, to stress from school, or the chaos that came with adolescence. But then, it became more deliberate, more precise, a pattern impossible to ignore. She began questioning every decision I made, from the mundane to the significant. "Why are you buying that?" she would ask, her voice loaded with disdain, even when the purchase was practical. "Don't you know how to budget?" There was no real anger behind her words, only a calculated superiority, a tone that suggested I was incapable, foolish, undeserving. And when I tried to explain, to offer context or reasoning, her eyes would narrow, her expression turning icy, dismissing me before I even finished speaking. It wasn't only the words, it was the gestures, the micro-expressions, the quiet scoffs I caught in passing. I had spent years providing for this family, sacrificing personal ambitions to ensure they never lacked, yet suddenly my presence felt burdensome, my guidance unwelcome. The daughter who once clung to me after nightmares now crossed the room to avoid my touch. The smiles she reserved for me were replaced with polite nods and hollow acknowledgments. Every act of care I extended was met with subtle disregard, as if my devotion was a weakness to exploit. The arrogance was growing, and with it a kind of quiet theatricality. She would recount my past mistakes in casual conversation, in front of friends or relatives, painting me as incompetent, forgetful, or incapable. It wasn't overt cruelty, nothing that could be easily challenged, but a steady undermining presence that slowly eroded respect. I began to second-guess myself, questioning whether I had failed as a parent, whether my sacrifices had blinded me to the true nature of the person I had raised. Her ambitions were clear. She spoke often of her goals, her plans, the kind of life she envisioned for herself, often highlighting that my struggles were irrelevant to her vision. I noticed her subtle maneuvering, positioning herself in ways that prioritized her gain, ignoring or even marginalizing my input. Family decisions that once involved discussion were now dominated by her voice. I found myself sitting quietly, offering suggestions that were brushed aside as though my opinions no longer mattered. My spouse, too, began to shift. While less overtly cruel, their behavior reinforced the daughter's subtle manipulation. There were moments when I would bring up my day, my worries, the anxiety of unemployment, and I would be met with gentle dismissals or patronizing advice. "You'll figure it out," they would say, their tone casual but distant, leaving me with the unmistakable feeling that I was alone in carrying the weight of my own fears. Still, Despite the growing tension, a part of me clung desperately to hope. I reminded myself of better days, of times when our laughter had filled the house, when hugs were freely given and worries shared without judgment. I held on to the belief that at some point, understanding and reconciliation would return. Perhaps my daughter didn't realize the pain she was inflicting. Perhaps my spouse was merely distracted by life's pressures. I wanted to believe in them, to see the goodness I knew existed beneath the pride and ambition, but the signs were undeniable. The dismissals, the quiet scoffs, the careful erasure of my contributions. They were building a wall between me and the family I had devoted myself to. I could feel it, a weight pressing against my chest, an unspoken message that I was no longer central, no longer valued. And yet the hope remained stubborn, whispering that maybe, just maybe, a conversation, an apology, a moment of recognition could restore the bonds that were quietly fracturing. I clung to that hope even as I felt the first real pangs of fear. The house I had built with love now felt foreign, the warmth of family replaced by calculated distance. I didn't yet know how far the manipulation would go, how much humiliation I would endure, but I sensed the storm gathering, ready to test every ounce of patience, love, and dignity I had left. And so I waited, bracing for the inevitable, praying that reason and compassion would prevail. Even as the first shadows of rejection began to fall across the home I had once thought unshakable. The days after the dismissal bled together into a relentless gray blur. Each morning I woke with a knot of dread in my stomach, the weight of unemployment pressing down like a leaden shroud. I scoured job listings, polished resumes, and wrote cover letters that seemed to vanish into a void. Rejection emails arrived faster than I could read them, each one a fresh sting, a reminder that the world I once navigated with confidence now seemed alien and hostile. I tried to remain composed in front of my family, to project calm and optimism, but the cracks in my facade were widening. I reached out to friends and colleagues I had once helped, people I had gone out of my way to support in times of need. Some replied politely, offering vague words of encouragement, while others didn't respond at all. Every unanswered message felt like confirmation that I was alone, that the safety net I had assumed existed was nothing more than an illusion. I carried on regardless, telling myself that resilience was not just necessary, it was mandatory. There was no other choice. At home, the tension was palpable. I tried to engage with my children to maintain a semblance of the bonds we had once shared. I asked about their days, offered advice on schoolwork, and made small gestures meant to remind them of my presence and love. Sometimes I caught a fleeting smile or a nod of acknowledgement, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that all might be restored. But these moments were rare, fleeting as shadows at dusk. More often, my efforts were met with disinterest or subtle hostility. The daughter who had once clung to me for comfort now glanced at her phone mid-conversation, her attention elsewhere, her patience thin. The spouse who once leaned on me for support now nodded politely and moved on, their words carefully neutral, their tone distant. I began to notice the small cruelties, the ways in which I was being edged out of the life I had built. A whispered remark, a rolled eye, a sigh heavy with impatience. These gestures accumulated, eroding my confidence and reinforcing a painful truth I had not wanted to see. My family's coldness was intentional, deliberate, a calculated force, pushing me toward the margins. Each day I fought the rising despair, trying to remind myself that love and patience could mend even fractured hearts. I confided in my friends when I could, admitting the depth of my fear and humiliation. Some listened with compassion, offering advice or comfort. Others seemed uncomfortable, uncertain of how to respond, which left me feeling even more isolated. I wrestled internally with shame, with the sense that I had failed not only as a provider, but as a parent and partner. Every rejection, every glance of indifference was a reminder that I was no longer central to the lives I had once guided and protected. Yet I persisted. I took temporary jobs, menial work that paid little but kept me afloat, attempting to show my family that I was still capable, still determined, still worthy of respect. I cooked meals, cleaned the house, and made myself present in ways that were invisible, unnoticed, as if my contributions were no longer relevant. Each act of service felt like a small rebellion, a quiet declaration that I would not vanish entirely, that I would not surrender to the growing coldness that surrounded. Still, the emotional toll was immense. I spent nights awake, replaying conversations in my head, analyzing tones, calculating responses, questioning every word I had spoken. I wondered if I had misread the signs, if perhaps my family's harshness was temporary, a product of stress or misunderstanding. But the pattern was undeniable. The distance between us was widening, and every attempt at connection was met with resistance or indifference. I realized that love alone might not bridge this gap, that some walls were built not of bricks but of pride, ambition, and subtle cruelty. By the end of each week, I was exhausted, not from the physical labor of job hunting or household chores, but from the relentless emotional exertion of maintaining hope in the face of persistent rejection. I questioned myself constantly. Had I failed as a parent? Had I misjudged the ambitions of my children? Had I overlooked the growing arrogance and selfishness that now dominated our household? And then, one evening, as I prepared a simple dinner, I overheard a conversation that confirmed my fears. My daughter spoke quietly to a friend on the phone, her words sharp, precise, devoid of warmth, discussing plans that completely excluded me. It was then that I realized, with a sinking weight in my chest, that the coldness I felt was not accidental, not fleeting. It was deliberate. The tension in the house, the subtle humiliations, the disregard for my presence, it was all intentional. Sat at the edge of the table, hands trembling slightly, staring at the phone as her laughter floated from the living room. The warmth I had once taken for granted was gone. I felt a profound sense of betrayal, a knowledge that my struggle to reconnect was not only uphill but perhaps impossible. The storm was no longer just outside me. It had taken residence inside the walls of the home I had fought so hard to protect. Exhaled slowly, trying to steady the surge of panic and hurt. I had fought this hard, sacrificed this much, yet the family I had devoted myself to was pulling away, building walls I could not yet climb. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I understood that the hardest battles were not against the world outside, but the coldness within my own home. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Simple interactions became strained. Conversations reduced to curt exchanges, and every word I spoke seemed to carry the weight of judgment. My presence, once welcomed and relied upon, was now met with subtle rebukes and cold indifference. The daughter who had once sought guidance now offered criticism disguised as advice, while my spouse, calm on the surface, delivered remarks laced with passive-aggressive undertones. I could feel the walls closing in, the safe haven I had built, turning into a cage of emotional isolation. Requests for money became a recurring source of tension. They arrived in forms that were casual, almost offhanded yet impossible to ignore. "Can you cover this?" my daughter would ask, her voice sweet but edged with expectation. When I hesitated, she raised an eyebrow, a small smirk playing on her lips as though my reluctance were proof of my inadequacy. I had been financially stable once, able to support my family without question, but now every dollar I had was precious, a dwindling resource in a world that no longer accommodated my mistakes. I gave what I could, though it never seemed enough. Respect, too, became a battlefield. My opinions were dismissed in conversations that once involved thoughtful discussion. Family decisions, even minor ones, were made without consulting me, as if my input were irrelevant. When I voiced a concern, I was met with sighs, eye rolls, or thinly veiled condescension. Each dismissal stung more than the last, eroding my confidence and reminding me that I was no longer viewed as a pillar of this household, but as an obstacle to be tolerated. The emotional abuse, subtle yet relentless, began to take its toll. I caught fragments of conversations meant to exclude me, laughter that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, whispers of impatience and annoyance. It was as if my presence had become an inconvenience, a burden that needed careful management. I tried to counteract the coldness with warmth, offering patience and understanding, but every gesture was either ignored or met with barely concealed irritation. The more I reached out, the more evident it became that I was being pushed away, slowly, methodically, until the home felt foreign and unwelcoming. Isolation deepened with each passing day. I found myself retreating to quiet corners, reading, reflecting, or replaying the interactions that left me feeling diminished. I questioned my worth, my role in the family, and whether the sacrifices I had made had been in vain. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house pressed down on me, amplifying memories of laughter and warmth that now seemed impossibly distant. I longed for reassurance, for a single moment that reminded me I still mattered, but it never came. And yet, I persisted. I reminded myself that love required endurance, that patience and understanding could sometimes bridge even the widest divides. I continued to help where I could, to offer support without expectation even as I felt my own spirit fraying. Every act of service became both a lifeline and a test of my resilience, a reminder that I could endure hardship, even when the people I loved most treated me as expendable. But the tension was no longer subtle. It had sharpened, growing into a palpable storm that filled the rooms with unsaid accusations and quiet resentment. Every glance, every word, seemed loaded with meaning, and I could sense that a breaking point was approaching. The calculated indifference, the passive-aggressive remarks, the unspoken expectations, they all pointed to an inevitable confrontation. I felt it in my bones. The betrayal was intensifying, and the moment when everything would erupt was drawing near. I sat quietly at the edge of the living room, the weight of unspoken conflicts pressing down on me. I knew that the storm I had sensed for weeks was about to break, and when it did, nothing would be the same. The house, once a refuge, was now a battlefield, and I could feel the first tremors of the explosion that would change the course of our family forever. It happened on an evening that began like any other, quiet and unremarkable, but I should have known that calm always precedes a storm. I had spent the day trying, once again, to show my family that I still belonged, that I still cared. I prepared dinner, something simple but made with care, hoping that the small gesture might soften the chill that had settled over our home. I smiled as I set the plates on the table, a tentative hope flickering in my chest. But the moment I stepped into the dining room, that hope was extinguished in an instant. My daughter, seated across from me, didn't even glance up. Her expression was sharp, eyes narrowed with something I couldn't name at first, but soon recognized: contempt. My spouse sat beside her, a polite smile that didn't reach their eyes, a silent alliance I had only begun to suspect. The air was heavy, charged with an electric tension that made my skin crawl. "Do you really think you belong here?" my daughter asked, her voice calm, almost clinical, but every word was laced with venom. I froze, the fork in my hand trembling slightly. "We've talked about this before," she continued, "and we've made our decision. You're unnecessary. A weight we no longer wish to carry." The words cut deeper than any slap, slicing through the years of sacrifices I had made, the nights spent worrying, the days spent providing, the countless times I had put their needs above my own. I tried to speak, to explain, to plead for understanding, but my voice failed me. My throat felt tight, as though every word I wanted to say was being swallowed by the disbelief and heartbreak that had settled over me. Then, in a moment that will haunt me forever, she stood abruptly and stepped forward. Her hand, swift and deliberate, struck my cheek with a sharpness that sent a jolt of pain through my body. I staggered back, stunned, not only by the physical impact, but by the emotional blow of being so openly rejected by my own child. I had endured slights, cold shoulders, and dismissals, but nothing had prepared me for this public, undeniable, humiliating act of betrayal. "You're a burden," she said again, her tone unwavering, as if repeating a fact rather than delivering a blow. "We have someone else now. Someone who actually belongs here, who adds value, who, unlike you, can provide. You've had your chance and you've failed." I looked at my spouse, desperate for a sign of support, for a single glance that might tell me this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. but their eyes were distant, unreadable, a mask of polite indifference that made my heart shatter further. It wasn't just my daughter. It was the household itself, the very people I had devoted my life to, rejecting me in a coordinated, calculated way. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in as reality hit me. I had given everything, and now it was clear that my love, my sacrifices, my years of devotion were meaningless. I had believed in the bonds of family, in the idea that blood and shared history would shield me from harm. But here they were, openly choosing someone else over me, a new step-parent, a figure of authority and approval that I had never anticipated, who had stepped into the space I had worked my entire life to protect. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I could feel the humiliation radiating through my very being, a deep, raw ache that made every movement heavy, every thought sharp and painful. Every memory of care, of nurturing, of effort spent tirelessly for their well-being now seemed like a cruel joke. I had been replaced not gradually, not subtly, but in one devastating, undeniable act. I wanted to scream, to demand explanation, to force them to see the cruelty of their actions. But my energy was gone. My heart, my spirit, had been drained by the years of subtle abuse, the growing indifference, the constant feeling of being unwelcome. And now, with this final act, the last vestige of hope I had clung to evaporated completely. I backed away, my chair scraping against the floor, a harsh sound that seemed deafening in the silent, judgmental room. My daughter's gaze followed me, unflinching, her satisfaction barely concealed. My spouse remained seated, hands folded neatly, their eyes averted in polite detachment as though my suffering were irrelevant. The new figure, the person who had somehow taken my place, smiled warmly, oblivious to the storm they had been, chosen to embody, the void they had stepped into. I turned, the weight of betrayal crushing me with every step. I could hear their voices in the background, the soft murmurs of normalcy that had once been mine now belonging to someone else. Each footstep toward the door felt heavier than the last, as if the floor itself resisted my departure. The love I had poured into this house, the sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had nurtured, all of it lay shattered behind me. Outside, the cool evening air hit my face, a harsh contrast to the suffocating heat of humiliation I had left behind. I stood on the porch, hands trembling, staring into the fading light of the street. The home I had built with love, that I had fought to protect and sustain, was no longer mine. The people I had trusted most, who I had believed would always stand by me, had turned their backs, choosing rejection over reconciliation, coldness over compassion. I felt a hollow ache settle deep in my chest, a grief so raw it threatened to consume me entirely. Every memory, every moment of devotion now seemed meaningless, a prelude to the profound loneliness I faced. I did not know where I would go, whom I could trust, or if I would ever be accepted again. For the first time, the world outside my home felt vast, uncertain, and terrifying, a place where my presence was no longer welcome, a place where I was utterly alone. I took a deep breath, the night pressing down around me, and realized that everything had changed. The life I had known, the family I had devoted myself to, the love I had assumed would endure, it was gone. And in that silence, standing on the threshold of a home that no longer belonged to me, I understood that there was no turning back, no soft landing, no return to the life I had lost. The future stretched ahead, dark and uncharted, and I had no choice but to take the first uncertain step into the unknown. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Simple interactions became strained, conversations reduced to curt exchanges, and every word I spoke seemed to carry the weight of judgment. My presence, once welcomed and relied upon, was now met with subtle rebukes and cold indifference. The daughter who had once sought guidance now offered criticism disguised as advice, while my spouse, calm on the surface, delivered remarks laced with passive-aggressive undertones. I could feel the walls closing in, the safe haven I had built turning into a cage of emotional isolation. Requests for money became a recurring source of tension. They arrived in forms that were casual, almost offhanded yet impossible to ignore. "Can you cover this?" my daughter would ask, her voice sweet but edged with expectation. When I hesitated, she raised an eyebrow, a small smirk playing on her lips, as though my reluctance were proof of my inadequacy. I had been financially stable once, able to support my family without question, but now every dollar I had was precious, a dwindling resource in a world that no longer accommodated my mistakes. I gave what I could, though it never seemed enough. Respect, too, became a battlefield. My opinions were dismissed in conversations that once involved thoughtful discussion. Family decisions, even minor ones, were made without consulting me, as if my input were irrelevant. When I voiced a concern, I was met with sighs, eye rolls, or thinly veiled condescension. Each dismissal stung more than the last, eroding my confidence and reminding me that I was no longer viewed as a pillar of this household, but as an obstacle to be tolerated. The emotional abuse, subtle yet relentless, began to take its toll. I caught fragments of conversations meant to exclude me, laughter that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, whispers of impatience and annoyance. It was as if my presence had become an inconvenience, a burden that needed careful management. I tried to counteract the coldness with warmth, offering patience and understanding, but every gesture was either ignored or met with barely concealed irritation. The more I reached out, the more evident it became that I was being pushed away, slowly, methodically, until the home felt foreign and unwelcoming. Isolation deepened with each passing day. I found myself retreating to quiet corners, reading, reflecting, or replaying the interactions that left me feeling diminished. I questioned my worth, my role in the family, and whether the sacrifices I had made had been in vain. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house pressed down on me, amplifying memories of laughter and warmth that now seemed impossibly distant. I longed for reassurance, for a single moment that reminded me I still mattered, but it never came. And yet, I persisted. I reminded myself that love required endurance, that patience and understanding could sometimes bridge even the widest divides. I continued to help where I could, to offer support without expectation even as I felt my own spirit fraying. Every act of service became both a lifeline and a test of my resilience, a reminder that I could endure hardship, even when the people I loved most treated me as expendable. But the tension was no longer subtle. It had sharpened, growing into a palpable storm that filled the rooms with unsaid accusations and quiet resentment. Every glance, every word seemed loaded with meaning, and I could sense that a breaking point was approaching. The calculated indifference, the passive-aggressive remarks, the unspoken expectations, they all pointed to an inevitable confrontation. I felt it in my bones. The betrayal was intensifying, and the moment when everything would erupt was drawing near. I sat quietly at the edge of the living room, the weight of unspoken conflicts pressing down on me. I knew that the storm I had sensed for weeks was about to break, and when it did, nothing would be the same. The house, once a refuge, was now a battlefield, and I could feel the first tremors of the explosion that would change the course of our family forever. It was months before clarity began to emerge, slowly, almost painfully, like the first light of dawn after a long night. In the quiet of my solitude, I started to piece together fragments of conversations I had overheard, emails I had glanced at, and subtle actions I had dismissed as arrogance or cruelty. The picture that formed was not one of callousness or malice, but of misunderstandings and misjudged intentions that had been magnified by fear, ambition, and assumptions. I discovered that my daughter's behavior, sharp and cutting as it had roots in anxiety and pressure I had never fully understood. She had been struggling with her own challenges, feeling overwhelmed by expectations she feared she could never meet. My spouse, distant though they appeared, had been grappling with guilt, unsure how to protect both their child and me without causing further harm. The new step-parent I had assumed replaced me had, in truth, been attempting to bridge gaps, provide support, and stabilize a household teetering on emotional imbalance, not to humiliate or diminish me. As the layers of misunderstanding unfolded, I realized how much of the perceived betrayal had been a reflection of my own fears and exhaustion. The anger, the heartbreak, the humiliation, it had all been compounded by the emotional toll of years of sacrifice, of putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own without pause. My family's actions, while initially painful and shocking, were not a deliberate attack on my dignity. They were the byproducts of human imperfection, miscommunication, and the complex interplay of love and expectation. This revelation did not erase the pain. The slap, the harsh words, the night spent alone feeling abandoned, those experiences remained vivid, etched into my memory. Yet understanding provided a different lens. It allowed me to see that my suffering, while real, had meaning. It was a mirror reflecting my devotion, my willingness to endure, and my capacity to love even when unappreciated. I had not failed. I had given fully, and in doing so, I had demonstrated the depth of my humanity. I reached out cautiously, opening lines of dialogue that I had once feared would be closed forever. Conversations that began tentatively grew into honest discussions, with questions, explanations, and apologies exchanged with humility and sincerity. My family, too, revealed their struggles, their insecurities, and their moments of weakness. Slowly, the walls of distance and tension began to erode, replaced by mutual understanding and a recognition of each other's humanity. It was not perfect. Reconciliation, healing rarely is, but it was a start, a proof that even fractured bonds could find their way back through honesty, empathy, and patience. The moral became clear to me, one that resonated far beyond the boundaries of my household. Love is not measured solely by immediate gratitude or perfect behavior. Sacrifice, dignity, and truth hold their own weight, even when unrecognized or misunderstood. Betrayal, humiliation, and rejection may inflict pain, but they cannot erase the intrinsic value of a life lived with integrity and devotion. Our worth is not determined by others' approval, but by the consistency with which we uphold compassion, resilience, and honesty in the face of hardship. I carried this lesson with me into every subsequent action, every word spoken to my children, every effort to rebuild my life. I realized that my pain had shaped me, strengthened me, and allowed me to appreciate the fragility and preciousness of family. I saw that forgiveness was not just an act toward others, but a gift I gave myself, a release from the burden of bitterness and despair. In understanding the truths behind the actions that had hurt me, I found freedom and a renewed capacity to love without expectation, to nurture without resentment, and to live without the shadow of past humiliation dictating my choices. The house, that had once felt cold and unwelcoming, began to regain warmth, not because everything returned to how it had been, but because awareness and honesty replaced assumptions and fear. I understood that family, like all human connections, is fragile and requires constant care, communication, and empathy. The pain of the past remained, a reminder of vulnerability, but it no longer held dominion over my heart. I had learned that dignity, truth, and love are stronger than betrayal, that patience and understanding can bridge even the deepest divides, and that the human heart, resilient and forgiving, can endure hardships without losing its essence. And in that understanding, I finally found the quiet peace I had been searching for all along. Standing on the threshold of what had once been my life, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Losing my job had been devastating, but the deeper loss had been the rejection from the family I loved most. Yet through the pain, the tears, and the solitude, I discovered a truth stronger than any hurt. My worth is not defined by others' approval, and love, when given genuinely, leaves a lasting mark, even if unacknowledged. I learned to forgive, not for them but for myself, to reclaim dignity and hope. Life had tested me, broken me, and yet I was still standing, ready to embrace tomorrow with courage and an unshakable heart.